To do a complete history of what came to be known as the Philadelphia experiment, because it was not known by that name in the beginning, you have to go back to 1931, long before I was involved in it. In 1931, Nikola-Tesla, Dr. John Hutchinson at the University of Chicago, and a staff physicist whose name I was given was Emil Kurtenauer. I did not know either of these other two people. Became involved in what was a theoretical study of how do you make an object invisible. Now, I don't know how this came up, why it came up at that time, or whether it's strictly Tesla's idea, or whether it was a mutual idea kicked around, because at that time he did a lot of travel and he did go to the University of Chicago rather frequently. In any case, they did what we would today call a feasibility study. How can you possibly do this sort of thing? And in the process of that feasibility study, of course, in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became elected president of the United States, 32nd president. And he called Tesla down to Washington to talk with him as his old friend. Quite literally, from World War I days, one in 1917, Tesla was invited to do work for the government, which he readily did. And he was separated at that point, as were many other engineers, from the old Marconi works, actually the North American Marconi Corporation, which was dissolved. In 1919, a new company was formed called RCA. Tesla became part of that, along with many other engineers who had been originally with the Marconi works. So he was holding down a position right through 1939 as an engineer, principal engineer, chief engineer. And in 1935, he became Chief of Engineering and Research Worldwide for RCA. But this was also during the period when he was doing a few other things. He was, unlike his biographer, John J. O'Neill said, he was a recluse living in his little room in the Hotel New Yorker. He was anything but. So in this feasibility study, he was called to Washington to meet with Roosevelt again, my old friend Nikola, etc. What are you doing these days? And of course the subject of the study came up. Roosevelt made the suggestion to him after some discussion, I would like to have you continue this work. It sounds like it could be interesting as a possible military usage at some future date if it's successful. And I'll make you the director of this thing, and I'll see to it that you get some research money from the Navy. Roosevelt, of course, was a very strong Navy man and had all kinds of pull with the Navy Department. So they got money under the table, if you will, from Office of Naval Engineering to continue this research, and they moved it to a more convenient location, at least for Tesla as well as for other people, to the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey, which had just opened its doors, so to speak, for business in 1933. There were 4 original people who signed on as full staff members. Dr. John, excuse me, let's see, we'll take it in order. There's Dr. Alexander, whom I know very little of. There's a Dr. Oswald Veblen. There was, of course, Albert Einstein. I'm sure everybody's heard of Albert Einstein. They all signed on in 1933, as well as my old mentor, John, what is his name? Damn it.
Van Neumann?
John Van Neumann, who also signed on at that particular time. All of them came on board in 1933. Tesla was not ever officially a member of that team, was not ever officially a member of the Institute. He was a consultant to the project, and as such came in and out, and they kept no file or record on him in terms of any of the work that he did. He was not paid by the Institute. And as they told me much later when I started doing my investigations, we do not keep a file on somebody unless he's a member of the staff and paid by the Institute. So they continued their theoretical work in New Jersey instead of Chicago on Institute grounds. And of course the Institute, while it opened its doors in 1933, hardly had a real physical facility which they could call their own. So they used some of the other Princeton properties, and Institute of Advanced whatever was used in many respects as a cover for the fact they were using older buildings as part of the actual Princeton University. They did build an administrative hall called Fold Hall, which was completed in 1939. They did build a new lab completed in 1939. Prior to that, they had an old wooden lab building, which I still have pictures of, and they used a lot of other buildings which were loaned to them. Eventually, they had all their own facilities, but it took time and money.
How many people do you think were actually involved in the project at that time? Was it just those four or many others?
At the beginnings of the Institute, there were only 4 people involved as actual staff scientists. There was, of course, Mr. Bamberger, who was the director of the Institute, at least at that time in the initial years, and he took the money which had been given to them in a trust to dispense it, if you will, to the formation and control and usage of the Institute for Advanced Study. I guess the idea of the charter is to do very advanced research beyond what is normally conducted in a university setting, at least the normal universities, and it became a premier think tank. Now, of course, there were other think tanks in the U.S. There was one on the West Coast, but at that time, in the 30s and early 40s, it was considered the premier think tank in the United States, not to say that there were not others. And, of course, it attracted people like Albert Einstein and Dr. John von Neumann, and eventually other people who came on board, like T. Townsend Brown, who became part of the Institute because of one of the projects he was working on. And I don't know to this day whether he was a full staff member or another consultant as such. He worked on a different project, but it was related, namely the problems of the German magnetic mines. That was primarily done with the Navy, but it also overlapped the Philadelphia experiment, and T. Townsend Brown became part of that experiment and the theoretical work himself, because he was an expert in RF as well as certain other areas of physics. One of the other people involved as a consultant to the project was at MIT. There was a professor there, Dr. Norman Levinson, who has a rather interesting long history. He wrote 5 books on mathematics in the public domain. John von Neumann wrote some 15, including one compilation of earlier works. And those of John von Neumann went well past the time of his alleged death in 1957. This is somewhat getting a little ahead of the story. For these people, the 4 original staff members saw eventually an increase in the people working there. I didn't keep track of this because I was not on staff. I was with the Navy after I joined the Navy. This all happened prior to my joining the Navy in 1939 when I finished my work on the PhD in physics. And the prior history involves the fact that they did do an early experimental test, and that was in 1936 at the Institute. It was not successful. It was essentially a failure, but apparently it gave them an indication of what they were doing and where they were going, and the fact that they were more or less heading in the right direction. As what I was told later after I joined the Institute, what they were attempting to do was create an artificial field around an object which they wanted to become invisible. Of course, they start with something fairly small to begin with, perhaps like a teacup on a table, or perhaps something a little larger, but a small object requiring relatively low power. But the theory says that what they were going to do to make it invisible was see that light and any electromagnetic energy would pass either through the object or around it. And if there is no reflection from the object, obviously it is invisible. There has to be reflected light to some medium, whether it's your eye or a camera, in order for it to be detected. In the case of radar, of course, to the radar detection system. The first test in 1936 was essentially unsuccessful, but it gave them some hope and apparently direction. And they kept getting the money from the Navy, and in 1939 they had hopes of a much better test, and they had a very successful one in 1940. I became part of the project along with Brother Duncan in January of 1940.
Let's go back a little bit and answer the question, why this interest in invisibility in the first place?
The interest in invisibility in the very first place was more or less of a theoretical study, like Tesla engaged in these things. Can you do this? Can you do that? It was sort of